YouTube Live, and my name is Keith, and I'm the founder of Keith RN. I have a resource website that serves the needs of educators by creating innovative resources to empower educators to really transform the way they teach and to be part of the needed change. And it's really great to be with you tonight. It's a beautiful spring day here in Minnesota, and I just love to know, where are you all coming from this evening as we spend the next 30 to 40 minutes really just kind of entering what I call the no spin zone of nursing education. You know, my goal isn't to sell you my resources or other tools that I've developed, but to really make educational best practices practical. And really excited today. Going to do something a little bit differently today. I don't have any guests tonight, but what I'm going to do is some very powerful principles that I think can really serve the needs of educators. I'm going to be answering two very important questions that really trended quite aggressively in the educator Facebook group that I'm an admin for, called Teachers Transforming Nursing Education. And if you are not a part of that group, I'm going to pop it on the screen. That's the group name. Go to Facebook. I'm not a huge Facebook person, but this is a powerful community of 7,500 educators who really support each other. You answer any questions and you get lots of feedback and really support to your solutions or the challenges that you're facing. So we'll be talking about that today. But I also we'll also be talking about the science of learning. You know, as we look at next gen, we look at the need to develop clinical judgment to prepare our students for practice and licensure. We really got to make educational best practices practical, and that's active learning. But then we must use the science of learning. How was our brain created and designed to learn? And how can we as educators align our teaching strategies with the science of learning to make it stick so our students really can retain the knowledge that's essential and then use it at the bedside of patient care where it matters most. But before we get started, I got one important update I want to share with you, is that I just recently had my dissertation published in ProQuest. I graduated from William Carey University with my PhD in nursing ed and administration in August of last year. Finally got everything finalized, and it's now available on ProQuest. And this is the title: Impact of Unfolding Case Studies on the Development of Critical Thinking in Baccalaureate Nursing Students. And use my name to find it. And that's a powerful, I'm going to let you read it. It's a relatively light reading for a dissertation. It's only about 80 pages, double spaced. That's about maybe a good chapter or two in a good book. So it's not that long, but it's very powerful. And it's got a lot of great information that will really kind of provide the background of why we need to change in nursing education, and really making the case for case-based learning, and really what the kind of chapter 2 with the lit summary and all that's available on the lit review that I did to really dig deep on case studies and case-based learning really would empower any educator, especially chapters 1 and 2. And I really am also quite interested in doing additional studies on case-based learning and really using some innovative strategies to really measure clinical judgment. And some of that's in my dissertation in chapter 3. But if you've got a passion that you too would like to basically align and do some research at some point in the future, please contact me, and I would love to get in touch with you, and we could collaborate on just basically anything related to developing clinical judgment using case studies. That is a gap in the literature that we still need to address. And so it's really still a problem that we need to kind of recognize is still out there. And so if you're checking this Facebook stream for the first time, you know, really my goal is to support you, the educators in the trenches, with really just making educational best practices practical. And this Facebook Live is available on my Facebook page, Keith RN, Think Like a Nurse. I've been doing this for about a year now. And I've got some great topics, some great guests that have joined me in the past that I would encourage you to go to my Facebook page, Think Like a Nurse, and check it out. And know that these links are recorded under the video archive. So you can, if you found this information helpful, you want to share it, That link is available on Keith RN, Think Like a Nurse. And if you were with us 2 weeks ago, I just want to highlight Martha Johnson was with us, and she is a really innovative educator, talked about escape rooms and active learning, bringing clinical reasoning and other strategies. And so that's her website. If you missed that, I'd encourage you to check that out. But we're going to dive deep and go right into some of the trending topics. And what are some of the questions that educators are asking that I think are really important for every educator? And we're going to kind of just dig deep in the very first question that I've got. And this is, if you're in the Facebook group, you can go to this post by Caitlin Milliken. If you just go to search, you're going to see this was about 3 days ago. But she asked this very important question. What do you guys do for post-conference at clinical? I'm out of ideas, and I feel like my students are so drained and bored by the end of the day. And, you know, this is a situation that we all experience as nurse educators. We have, you know, now that our students are getting back into clinical situations, a clinical setting, or even in just virtual clinical, we just kind of want to be done, call it a day, go home. We're exhausted. The students are exhausted. But I want to encourage you, do not do that, because one of the most powerful aspects of clinical to develop clinical judgment is reflection on your thinking. And, you know, when we look at developing clinical judgment, we're going to go deep on this in probably the next Facebook Live. But Tanner's model of clinical judgment, I'm just going to kind of post that. I'm going to post this real quickly. I found a really great visual on this. And this is kind of looking at nursing process, Tanner's framework, and the NCSBN model. I'm not going to go deep into all this. I want you to look at the middle section of Tanner. Tanner has 4 steps of noticing, interpreting, responding, and reflecting on your thinking. And what we need to recognize, and what I want to encourage you all as educators, when you're looking at next gen, developing clinical judgment, nursing process, and Tanner's clinical judgment model align with the 6 steps of the NCSBN model. This is a great visual by Rosalinda Alfaro Lefebvre. She's got a great textbook on clinical reasoning and clinical judgment. She's got some great handouts as well on addressing clinical judgment. This handout shows how they align. And so a lot of us as educators, we're really stressed about next gen, the NCSBN model. We don't have to teach the NCSBN model. Let's teach nursing process and Tanner's clinical judgment framework. And that's really where we need to stay deep. And why I wanted to bring this up is when you look at Tanner's clinical judgment model, and this is a framework that all of us as educators must be familiar with. And Tanner's got an article called Thinking Like a Nurse, a research-based model of clinical judgment that really provides the essence of the reasoning that a nurse uses to make a judgment. And so Tanner's 4 steps align with nursing process, kind of, and you can see this in this visual, but the noticing and interpreting are the first 2 steps of Tanner. What do you notice from that assessment? What's your interpretation or the meaning? And then what's your response going to be with the plan of care? But then the 4th step, that's why I took a couple extra minutes. The 4th step of Tanner's framework to develop clinical judgment is reflecting on your thinking. And so when you look at reflection, we need to really have our students look at every decision that they made in that post-conference. What did they do well? What decisions were made? So we can't shortchange post-conference. And so I totally identify with Caitlin's question. And so we need to recognize, we need to dig deep and reflect on every decision your students made. Have them share, go around. What did you do well in clinical today? What decisions did you do? Let's talk about decisions that we made. Were they good decisions? Were they the right decisions? Let's reflect on it. Let's dig deeper, because the more that we reflect on every decision that a nurse makes in practice, we're developing clinical judgment. So that's the takeaway. That's why we must not shortchange debriefing in our simulations, which we typically don't, but especially debriefing or post-conference is the same thing. It's debriefing in the clinical setting. Let's not shortchange that either, because we shortchange clinical judgment. And so when we go deep on post-conference in that debriefing, we're developing clinical judgment. And I really want to encourage us as educators that there's many products out there that are going to be coming out in the next couple of years, and in fact, probably this fall. Next gen this, next gen this, next gen that, next this. You know what? Even the NCSBN is saying, if you teach your students nursing process and a research-based framework of clinical judgment, such as Tanner, and understand Tanner and implement it, your students, you're doing everything you need to do. But let's make it active and let's make it actionable. And so I want to just kind of build on some strategies that some of the group participants in Caitlin's post. So go to Caitlin's post tonight. Don't necessarily do it right this minute, but here's a couple things from educators that I just want to really give a shout out to, because there were some great strategies that we can use in post-conference to develop clinical judgment. One of the respondents said, go to the Board of Nursing website for public records of dispositions of nurses reported to the board. They explained the situation with detail and what happened to the nurse at the end. Now, this may be a little on the dark side because we don't want to scare our students, but we need to recognize the high standards of practice, but we can learn from the mistakes of others. Just like the wise person learns, not by making the mistake, but by learning from the mistakes of others. As nurse educators, we can look at our state board's website, because this is public knowledge. We can look and see exactly some states may have a different level of disclosure, but sometimes the background is there. Let's learn from the mistakes of other nurses so our students can grow and develop. Another strategy I'd love to give a shout out to was this: practice giving SBAR in post-conference, that the students do this together. She says, I assign them a medication at the beginning of the day, and they have to teach me like I am the patient family. When they say things like edema, I say, what does that mean? So this is kind of a two-tiered strategy. Number one, SBAR needs to be practiced. So let's practice. What was the SBAR you gave to your nurse? And tell us about your patient, but then give us the SBAR, and let's kind of do some critical reflection on SBAR. By reflecting on SBAR, we can strengthen not only SBAR, but clinical judgment and recognizing and highlighting what was most important. But I also love this principle of teaching and explaining the terms, because sometimes as students, and even as nurses, we can over assume what our family knows about some of these commonly used terms. Another strategy I want to share from this post was this, and I love this: choose 4 students and have them give report as if they are leaving for the day, then ask these questions. So you choose 4 students and they each have their patient, and they kind of give us a synopsis of their patient. But as we know in practice, are students going to have our nurses in practice have one patient on a typical med surg or tele unit, for example, in acute care? No, they're going to have 4 patients minimum. So therefore, each of these 4 students represents the 4-patient assignment. And now as a group, we basically then collaborate. And so let's have our 4 students are going to share their report on their patient. Who is the priority patient? Which one of these patients should be seen first by the nurse? Now, this is a different Facebook Live, but there's different parameters we can use to really practically identify priority patient. One of them is the age of the patient. The older the patient is, the higher at risk they are to develop complications. So we can talk about that in our post-conference. Then it's kind of looking at, some of the essential data needed from the chart, as well as priority assessments, and all that looks for. And so I just want to really encourage you to look at some of these creative strategies that educators shared, which I really thought were powerful and practical. But I also want to share in the chat, Amy, I have a link that is called a Guide for Reflective Journaling that Mojave Community College in California developed, and it's available on the website, and it's in the chat. And this is a powerful one-page worksheet that takes Tanner's clinical judgment model and makes it practical by, in essence, having these questions after clinical. These are just a couple I wanted to highlight because there's nothing like a good question to reflect on developing clinical judgment. And in this handout, here's a couple of questions. What would you do differently if you encountered this situation or had to do this decision again? What additional knowledge, information, and skills do you need when encountering this situation in the future? Or describe any changes in your values or feelings as a result of your clinical day. You know, when we talk about professional identity formation, our values and our feelings, what did you feel in clinical today? That's something we need to talk about in post-conference. And so I'd love to know if there's some things that you are doing. I'd love to get your feedback in the chat and just tell me what are some things that you are doing here in this chat right now that I could give a shout out to or kind of comment on that you're doing in post-conference that you have found successful to develop clinical judgment, because this is really, this is all about us as a community of educators supporting, strengthening, and really kind of empowering each other with best practices and how we can do that. So if you've got something to share, I'll kind of keep my eye on the chat to my right here and keep going. So if I see anything else that comes up to comment, I'll definitely do that. There was a second question that Bo Saltz asked. And let me just kind of pop him in the chat, or pop his question here, because I want you to search his name as the one who posted this question. He had like almost, I think, 80 to 100 hits on this question. What are practical things you have learned as a nurse in practice that students may not learn in nursing school, but need to know to be prepared for practice? Wow, that one really caught my attention because, as educators, you're also nurses. And you know what? You've got pearls of practice. And if there's one thing that I think we must never lose sight of in nursing education, and I think that we struggle with this at times with the NCLEX and the next gen NCLEX and our licensure pass rates because they define our program. But our goal, our ultimate objective is to prepare students for practice, safe patient care. And if we utilize best practices in the literature and the science of learning, our students will be prepared for NCLEX as a secondary result. We don't have to focus on the NCLEX. And I think we get so tunnel vision, we lose sight of practice. And so if you got some comments on that, or if I'm preaching to the choir, I'd love to know your thoughts on that. And you can throw some of your practice thoughts. But, I'm going to share some comments that educators shared on what are your pearls of practice. And one educator said this: character counts. She says that your attitude is tied up with character. Show up on time, put in the effort, help others, follow through on what you say you'll do. And this, admit your mistakes. And you know what? This is a powerful principle, not just for nurses in practice, but for our students. And that's why character matters. Cheating matters. That's why that's so destructive and detrimental to the profession of nursing. And so I love that comment and love that feedback that was shared in that comment. Another comment was, trust your gut. If your instinct tells you something is wrong, you may not know what it is, but trust your gut and follow through with it. Get a second opinion. I love that because intuition is something that takes clinical experience. But sometimes your students will just recognize, even as novice nurses, something's just not quite right. And so just recognize the practicality of that. And so another one that I'll share in closing is this. Keep your mouth closed and your face back when suctioning a trach. Are we teaching our students that? Sometimes we want to get our face right in there, but how many of you know that just when you least expect it, that patient coughs and it goes everywhere? Again, just those little things in practice that as nurses and nurse educators are big things. And so, let's help our students and let's bring practice back into nursing education and practice. And so if you have some thoughts or comments related to any of these two questions, I'd love to hear them. Misty said she uses case studies for post-conference, and one of the comments was that, using Keith RN case studies. I've got a skinny reasoning case study on COVID-19. It's a free download on keithrn.com. Practice some of the reasoning that your students may not get, or some of the most common patients, or even uncommon patients that are relevant in your clinical setting. Use a concise case study. One of the goals that we must do as educators is to bring context to our content. And we'll talk about that in just a moment, why that's so important. Some other thoughts I just want to give a shout out to. Thank you, Michelle. Put yourself in the patient and family shoes. Absolutely. That's just the essence of empathy. And I think sometimes some of us, that doesn't come naturally or doesn't come as easily to some of our students, but we've got to get inside that lived experience of each of our patients to help them do that, and what that looks like. Christy says she loves my case studies. Kim's love my case studies. And you know what? The case studies, this isn't about me, but what I do want to share with you all about Keith RN case studies is that there's a couple things that if you haven't used them that are really unique that no other case studies do. They're open-ended, which means that they replicate clinical realities because they don't have multiple choice. They unfold as a nurse experiences real-world care with vital signs, assessment, labs, putting it together. But they also, more importantly, they integrate Tanner's clinical judgment model and the 4 steps of what do you notice? One of the very first questions in every case study, what clinical data do you notice that is significant? And then why? Is it relevant? That's the noticing and interpretation, the 2-part dance, the first 2 steps of Tanner's framework. That's also next-gen thinking. So again, the case studies that I've written are relatively simple. They're low tech, but if you're using them, you're preparing your students for practice and next gen. So thank you so much for the love, man, that you guys are sharing. That really is an encouragement to me, and I really appreciate that. So thank you so much. As I look at just, one practice pearl that I'd love to share as an ER nurse, IV starts. Now, some programs may not be teaching IV starts, and many of them do. But if there's one thing that we want to help our students do to really make our veins show up that I've found to be a very simple strategy, alcohol wipes. Use the moisture to moisten up that area where you're going to, where you think there should be a vein, will highlight. It's just miraculous. But that moisture sheen and the light allows you to see shadows where they weren't there before. Try it sometime. And then you always want to use a low approach angle of 10 degrees, bevel up as you approach that vein, well secured when you've got that kind of a circumferential pulling on the right and left aspect so it doesn't roll, and just go until you see that flash, then go down to 0 degrees, go a little couple millimeters, and then thread the gel coat, because there's just a little bit of a bevel before the plastic gel coat is there, or you'll blow the vein. So those are my pearls from my experience as an ER nurse, and I love IV starts, can get those difficult ones in. So that's my pearls for the night. So anyways, just some thoughts. And so, yeah, Michelle misses starting IVs. Some of those clinical skills, are hard. If you're not in practice, it's like, yeah, those things we sometimes get a little rusty, but we're still trusty. Well, what I want to do in the last 10 minutes or so is have some fun with the science of learning, because really when we look at teaching more effectively, as educators. We really need to do some big picture principles. Number one, we really have to make learning active. And, sometimes we're saying, why? We need as educators to say, why flip my classroom? Why should I not give them a 70-slide PowerPoint in 30 minutes? Why? Everyone else was doing that, and the textbook publishers give us these wonderful content-heavy lectures that we can just simply copy and paste and present to our students. Well, the bottom line is the science of learning, when aligned with educational best practices. And again, Dr. Benner and the Carnegie Foundation's research really gave us 3 powerful principles I don't want you to ever to forget that really rocked my world. And I'm going to put this into context here with the science of learning. But Benner's paradigm shifts and her co-authors were really these 3 simple points. Contextualize your content to the bedside of patient care. Number 2, bring clinical and classroom together, not in separate orbits, but bring clinical realities into your classroom. Third, emphasize clinical reasoning, that thinking and action skill that really is what you do at the bedside of patient care. And that's where case studies are so powerful as a foundational strategy. But there's other things that we can do as educators. But let's talk about the science of learning and what that looks like. And I attended a conference a couple of years ago where Dr. David Daniel, an expert on the science of learning, had these insights that I blogged about. And Amy's got a link to my blog that has this information for you, so you can all easily just go to this link after this presentation or even during it. I won't take offense because I can't see what you're doing. But this is some of the insights Dr. Daniel had to share. And I want you to think about your teaching practice and say, am I doing that? Could I do it differently? Because really, to develop the clinical judgment our students need for safe practice, to really close the academic practice gap, we don't need to go to a concept-based curriculum. We don't need to change our curriculum, but we do need to do this. We need to transform and to change the way that we teach nursing. And that's where every one of you who are watching this live stream can really do it differently. You can teach differently. Remember Apple, when they first came out in the 90s, it was think differently was their motto. We need to learn from that. Teach differently. It's really that simple. So here's what Dr. Daniel had to share. He said that passive learning and spoon feeding students aborts the learning process. When we make learning passive and we just give our students the information, we abort the acquisition of knowledge. Because what Dr. Daniel said is this: work and effort is required for a student who is learning new information to make new neuronal connections. That the science of learning, and this is a word I want you to remember, neuroplasticity. It's a big word. neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity. Just Google it. But it tells us this: your brain never stops growing or expanding. Neural connections with new knowledge are being generated when learning is active. They have to get their bodies moving. They have to apply themselves. They have to write with their hands, not copy and paste or regurgitate. It has to be active for neuronal connections to happen. And literally, if you're a nurse, for example, who retires, the parts of your brain that you're using in practice begin to atrophy, kind of like a muscle. It's like your neurons will atrophy and those connections begin to weaken when it's passive or you're not doing the heavy work, the heavy lifting of learning. And so this is why learning must be active in your classroom. Now, can you do a concise lecture? Absolutely. No more than 15 to 20 minutes. But then you must hook it to active application of learning and how important that really is to practice. And so Stephanie is saying, do you recommend that students work on content case studies in class together or prior to class to discuss and review collaboratively? Stephanie, that's a wonderful question. And I would say it depends on your class and the class size. I really would encourage you to do both. I think that we need to raise the bar of having our students come to class prepared. And so like my skinny reasoning case studies, for example, come in 2 parts. 4 pages, 2 sections, 2 pages each. In the first page, 2 pages are Tanner's. What do you notice? What's your interpretation of the vital signs assessment, lab values? That could be a pre-class activity. The next 2 pages, you could then in class do together. Give them 10 or 15 minutes to now collaborate, come together, highlight the first 2 pages right away, and then collaboratively. Small group work really is a key tenet of adult learning theory. I'm not going to go deep on that today. That wasn't my focus, but small group work is something that students value, and adult learners value problem solving. So Stephanie, I would say do both. If you really want to rock it and raise the bar of expectation of knowledge when your students are preparing for class, like they prepare for clinical. If they come to clinical unprepared, most of us have no problem sending our students home. So why do our students come to our classrooms just saying, feed me? I think that's unacceptable. And that's where we can change culture. We can make a difference by changing the expectations of what we expect in our classroom. So let's be part of that change. And so that would just be my thoughts. And if you have any other questions or follow-up, Stephanie, please put it in the chat. But Dr. Daniel had this to share. Taking notes from PowerPoint is the worst way to learn for the long term. Yet that's how many of us, and historically, have been teaching nursing, because he says passive learning isn't meaningful learning. It doesn't result in long-term retention. And he said, if you're going to use PowerPoints, put as little text on the slide as possible, use images, and use that and have a discussion so your students have to synthesize and organize the content in their brain. So they do this work themselves. This is what will strengthen the effectiveness and the retention of your lecture content. What I would add to that is this: put less content on your slides and more textbook pages that your students can refer to, that they can not only read, but they need to synthesize. And that's kind of the next point that Dr. Daniel talked about, is that just reading a textbook and highlighting it is passive learning. Instead, encourage your students to synthesize each page or each key section in their own words. They have a notebook, they're writing it. They're actually using kinesthetic writing is going to use more muscle memory and more neuronal connections than even a typewriter, according to his research. Just some thoughts to consider. You know, he also talked about something I've really been sharing for the last 9 years as a nurse educator, sharing my strategies that Dr. Benner talked about, deep learning of what is most important. You know, we need to simplify our content with takeaways at the end of every lecture. So let me ask a simple question. How long are your slide presentations? And how long are you teaching? We should be shooting for 20 slides, 20 minutes, with lots of pictures, charts, and pages of the textbook. And again, identify those takeaways. If there's like 3 things you want your students to know from your lecture, summarize it like a good pastor does in a sermon. They'll kind of just summarize the 3 bullet points of the highlights of a good sermon. That's what a good lecture is. Summarize those points and what that looks like. Just a thought to consider. And another thought that Dr. Daniel shared is this: emotions and learning are linked. When your students are anxious or fearful, those emotions are going to adversely impact learning, and it doesn't happen the way that we would like to. And I think that sometimes when you look at our students, they're stressed, they're burdened, and sometimes we as educators are kind of like the Pharisees at the time of Christ, who were burdening the Jewish people with burdens from the law that were never intended to be there. And I believe that sometimes we unintentionally burden our students with so much information. We don't differentiate need to know from nice to know. And our students are burdened and they're also stressed. And sometimes we as educators need to look at the mirror and say, are we contributing to some of the stress and the anxiety and the burdens that our students are experiencing? I'm not talking about making nursing school easy, because it shouldn't be. I'm just saying that sometimes as educators, we can make it more difficult than it has to be. And even our teaching strategies, if they're not aligned with some of these basic things I'm sharing with you today from Dr. David Daniel and his expertise as an expert on the science of learning, we're part of that problem. We don't want to do that. And so just kind of recognize that. But he also had this closing thought to share. Millennial students are no different than any other students. Sometimes we think that millennials are a unique generation, unlike any other generation of nursing students that's come before them. They must be entertained. They need technology. He says, you know what? The brain's been about the same since, for thousands of years. The science of learning and the principles of the science of learning hasn't changed. What's different, though, is that this generation of students is that they've had their life structured for them growing up, and they struggle to make choices. And I've heard the term snowflake. I wouldn't use that, but yet in principle, that kind of summarizes some of the challenges that our students have, and we see that in nursing school. And so recognize that and what that looks like. And so just realize that we can help our students grow, though. We want to recognize all of us are works in progress. I'm not perfect. Our students aren't perfect. But let's encourage growth, and let's do what we can to align our teaching with the science of learning. And, in closing, I'm just going to share one science of learning theory that is very powerful that Dr. Benner advocated in her book, Educating Nurses. And she's talked about situated cognition. Now, that's a big word, and most of us don't know what it means. When I read it the first time 10 years ago, I had to look it up. But situated cognition is a science of learning theory. And it postulates that separating knowledge from knowing how it is experienced in context, if it's not experienced in an authentic context, it's detrimental to learning. It doesn't stick. Let's just put that into nursing vernacular. Textbook PowerPoints that are content heavy with no context to how that textbook knowledge is to be used, it's like it doesn't stick. It doesn't last. It's not retained. That for learning to be meaningful and to be retained, it needs to be retrieved from a context, that it can be kind of like a peg, like you're climbing a mountain. It's like a scaffolding you can hook it onto. It needs context of a real life situation. That's why clinical practice, there's no substitute for clinical. We can do virtual learning, we can do case studies even, but the clinical and bringing context to content in the richness of patient care, there's no substitute for. The science of learning supports that we need situated cognition, or a context, in order for that content to be retained and retrieved. That's why, again, learning must be active. And so that's why the case studies that I've written, as well as other active learning principles, if they incorporate these principles of contextualizing our content and bringing meaningful active learning, synthesis of knowledge, we are, giving them not too much information. We can empower and strengthen the retention of the knowledge that we teach in our programs. And so I'm going to look at some of the questions. I've kind of said enough for one night, but I'm going to answer some of your questions. And so I'm going to start with Misty. So if you got some burning questions from the things I've shared, I want you to interact with me. We're doing this by Zoom or by Facebook Live, and it's like one of the benefits of this is that you can ask your question right now. So if you've got something that you'd like to share or a question or contribute to what I've shared tonight, I want to hear it. And so we'll take some time for that. And so Misty says this: what are your artful responses? I'm going to pop this on the screen so we can all see it together. What are your artful responses for students who feel they are teaching themselves and feeling as though flipped classrooms and interactive learning activities are not helpful? That is something I've been hearing for years, and it really annoys me because it's a lie. It's a deception, and it's really not true. And so we have to have a response. And I think that in essence, we need to come back and simply say this: doing an open, let's use one of the case studies that I've written that's open-ended. You know what? You could use the science of learning, things that I've just shared, that in order for learning, you could simply say this, Misty, share what I've shared tonight, that in order for your knowledge to be retained from this very important content that we're teaching, it must be brought into context with using an active learning strategy like a case study. And as an educator, I'm here to guide your learning, but the knowledge acquisition process is a 50-50. It is students must take the responsibility to learn. And as an educator, I am going to do 100% to teach you the best way possible, but you need to give 100% to your learning so you can be the best possible nurse possible. Because when it comes right down to it, Misty, nursing isn't about what you know and what you can memorize and what you can pass on the test, even the NCLEX. It all comes back to the bedside of patient care. And so we must always help our students say that you want to be the best for your patients, not just good enough to pass the test. That it all comes down to patient care. And let's not lose sight of patient care as we teach our students the next generation of nursing professionals. So let's not make it about the NCLEX. Let's not make it about next gen. Let's not make it about, yes, we want our students to be successful. So yes, I understand the importance of all of these tests in your program and at the end and at the end of the day. But let's balance that with practice and let's make that a reality. So Misty also has another question here. She says, there's some interesting research about students not liking flipped classes. I'm a big proponent for flipped classes and innovative strategies. That's true, Misty. And you know what? Tell me about if you had children. Were there things that sometimes you did that you knew it was best for them, but they didn't want to follow your rules? We had 5 children that are now adults. By the grace of God, they've launched well. But you know what? When they were adolescents, boy, did they push back at some of the things like curfews and rules of the house and things that were not acceptable. And if I just kind of gave them what they wanted, my children would be roadkill. They could be addicts, or they could be dead. Wouldn't have benefited them to give them what they want. And I'm not saying that as educators, we treat our students like children, but we need to recognize that as educators, we need to give our students what is best for them, which is educational best practices made practical. And we must hold the line. And that's where we need the support of leadership in our programs to say our student evaluations shouldn't be the metric of our success as faculty. It must be peer evaluations, not student evaluations. We need to consider them. But they shouldn't have the weight that they do in some programs, because in that environment, students are ruling at a level that they shouldn't be. They shouldn't be influencing our programs because we're concerned about our, student feedback, because we're doing innovative active learning. I'm sorry, I'm not going to go down that path. I'm going to resist that. And I don't know if I'm alone on that, but I hope not. But you're right. There is that research. Christy says this: you have to convince them why and start small also. Christy, I love that feedback. I'm going to highlight a couple things there. Just like as good educators with our students, we want to always say, why? Why do you raise the head of the bed if they're short of breath? Why do we do this? Why are we doing this for every aspect of the nursing plan of care? We expect that of our students. As educators, to get the buy-in that we need for innovative active learning that brings context to the content, we also need to communicate the why. And that's kind of what I shared earlier with Misty's question. So great question, Misty. I hope that addresses that in Chris. And also starting small, totally agree. If you have got a lot of lectures, and just choose one, take one lecture, make it active, cut it down in whatever it needs to be 20 minutes or less, make it need to know, practice centered, first year generalist. And then basically let's just kind of take it a step at a time and take it like the journey of 1,000 miles. I love the Chinese proverb, begins with the first step. You know what? That big journey to transform our content, our curriculum, our program begins with one classroom that you teach differently. And I just want to encourage all of you who are watching or listening to this, take that first step, whatever that looks like. That's why KeithRN.com exists, and other innovative educators like Martha, who I had 2 weeks ago. That's why she exists, to share her knowledge in innovative active learning strategies. Go to the Facebook group that exists to support you as educators. And so anyways, I'm glad that Misty, you're sold. I'm not trying to sell anybody. I'm just wanting to, hopefully a little of my passion, that sometimes I struggle with my energy at times, but I know that this is the right path. Dr. Benner says it's the right path. Let's be like Moses and let's follow these leaders to where the promised land of really transformation of nursing education. And so Melanie says this, you got to go, you've got Alex, you've got pushing back. He says, I had a semester of students pushing back from the flipped classroom and wanting a lecture. Melanie, let me share this. When I transformed my classroom 10 years ago, using these strategies from educating nurses, my very first case studies, and I was at a community college teaching first year, second semester students, and I was the only one doing active learning with the case studies. No other faculty in my team were doing that. I had read Benner's book. I knew it was right. I did things differently. First lecture was crickets. It was pulling them out of they were struggling. Second and third lectures, a little bit. But I will share this, Melanie. After the third or fourth lecture that I did, they began to see the relevance as adult learners. And our students are adult learners. They value relevance. If we are teaching relevant, need to know information, they recognize that versus a hoop that we jump through. They saw the relevance. By the end of the semester, I did a survey of all the students, got about 75%. It was an anonymous survey, but not one student, Melanie, said to go back to passive lectures. They saw the value of the active learning case studies that I developed. And they said, I wish all other faculty were teaching because this is helping me apply my learning to patient care. That's what it's all about. That's our goal, practice readiness. And if we teach practice readiness, the NCLEX will take care of itself. And so Dina says this, new educator, where can I find more information on flipped classrooms? Well, I will share this, Dina, is that there's, a lot on, if you were just to Google that term, but I will share this. I've written a book called Teach Students to Think Like a Nurse. And if you go to KeithRN.com, my general website, you'll see it on the bottom of the homepage. That's my best effort to help educators teach and develop clinical judgment. But there's a whole plethora of resources out there on flipped classrooms, active learning. And I would just encourage you to kind of Google other resources, but that's just one that comes to mind. Since I'm the author, I can it's right on the front of my own, of my front here. And so Martha says, thanks, Keith. And you know what? I just want to thank you all for being here tonight. And I just want you to know that I'm going to kind of end with my own takeaways. I'm going to kind of practice what I preached. If you've got some other questions, I look forward to hearing them. But I would just say this: teaching, then contextualizing nursing process and Tanner's clinical judgment model will prepare your students for practice and licensure, including next gen. That's point number one. Point number two, don't lose sight of practice. Share your pearls of practice. More importantly, share your stories. You know what? Your stories related to patient care brings context to your content. Very simply. You don't have to make this complicated. You don't have to do case studies. You start with a story. Think about your content. Think about your stories as a nurse. Your students need your stories to make it real, to learn from them, to grow from them, and they won't forget them. Third point, make learning active with context to make essential content stick. So again, active learning with context is really the essence of situated cognition. And so I have just scratched the surface of the science of learning. We're going to talk more about this in the weeks ahead. I do this every 2 weeks. And so if you get on my mailing list or in the Facebook group, you'll get a notification. But I just want you to know in closing that I do have a Facebook, I do have a membership site that's called Think Like a Nurse. I'm just looking for it right here. Where that is found here. Oh, I don't even have it on my thing here. But it's called thinklikeanurse.co. And it's an all-inclusive membership that's got over 110 case studies, other resources that it's probably my best resource to have educators access all the tools like a buffet that you need to bring clinical to your classroom and to all of your content, as well as some teaching webinars with contact hours and building on these things that I'm sharing here in these Facebook Live. This is really my pleasure to serve your needs. And I also have office hours, which is something I do every Friday. Do it tomorrow from 10 a.m. to 12 noon Central. You'll get a Zoom link in your email inbox. Just come on in. We'll talk, troubleshoot, any question, one-on-one. And so I just want you to know that I'm here to serve your needs. And so booking Facebook Lives in a couple of weeks, we'll talk about some additional trending topics in the Facebook group that are relevant to all of us. We'll build more on the science of learning. And I'll just check the chat here one last time. And so basically, Vu says this. She says, I'm a novice educator here. Like you, I'm a huge fan of Tanner's clinical judgment model. I preach it to my students. And you know, Vu, if you're doing that, and if you're making it practical, because every one of Tanner's steps of clinical judgment can be made into a question. Like the first step of noticing is what I ask, what clinical data do you notice that is relevant and why is it significant? You know, we need to make Tanner's framework kind of practical and actionable. So using it with case studies in your clinical, we just need to lay that foundation of Tanner's, and we don't need to teach the next gen model. You know, that's an evaluation model, not a practice model. Let's never forget that. Let's not go down this bunny hole of teaching and then expecting our students to basically regurgitate the 6 steps of the NCSBN model. It's an evaluation model, not for practice. Even the NCSBN says, don't do it. Now, there are some who differ, and they say we have to teach that. No, don't do that. That just is going to widen the academic practice gap that's already too big. So anyways, I'm kind of can go on my tangents, but I'm passionate about that. And anyways, thank you again. And yeah, Marissa, learning about Tanner's model. And you know what? It's been around for 15 years. And a lot of educators aren't aware of Tanner's model. And so, you know, if you could, Amy, if you could find the link to Tanner's article, Thinking Like a Nurse, put that link in the chat before we go, because I want every educator who's on this chat who doesn't know a lot about Tanner's clinical judgment model, like I've showed in that image at the beginning of this session, Tanner's framework of clinical judgment aligns with next generation NCLEX and the 6 steps of the NCSBN model that will be using case-based questions. With that framework, they have literally adapted The essence of Tanner's framework aligns with the 4 steps of Tanner, aligns with the 6 steps, and captures the essence of the NCSBN. That's why I say, let's just teach nursing process in Tanner's framework, make it practical, actionable, and that's what we need to do to strengthen and transform nursing education. So thank you so much, Amy, for your support tonight on the back end of my chat. I appreciate your help. And that's all I have for tonight. I want to thank you all for joining me for this hour. It's been a pleasure, and I wish you the best. And I'm here and available to you. So if you have any questions, I just want to put my email in there as well. You know what? I'm available to every educator. I will respond within 24 hours, usually same day. Just keith@keithrn.com. If you have a question, a challenge, a struggle, you just want to just troubleshoot it, I'll start by email, and I'm here to serve your needs. So thank you for all that you're doing to be part of the needed change. I couldn't do what I do without you. And at the end of the day, you are the hero on the front lines. I'm just on the back end supporting you, kind of like the reinforcements in battle, with some great tools and strategies, I hope. But you're the hero. Thank you for what you're doing. I want to encourage you to stay the course. Don't give up. The next generation of professional nurses is depending on you to make a difference. And you are. Just like sometimes with our children, we don't know it or realize it until a year or two later or down the road. So hang in there, and we'll talk in a couple of weeks. Thanks again. Have a good night.